Welcome everyone to Marxism Festival. My name's Sophia Beach. I'm one of the organisers of the event. Hopefully people have enjoyed it so far. If you've just arrived, welcome. Look, this is going to be a fantastic session and the rest of the weekend. So, you know, this is one of the biggest Marxism. This is the biggest Marxism we've had in 10 years. It's great to see so many people here. It's brilliant that the rain's held off. Just to introduce this session, we are very, very lucky and grateful to have Mr. Jeremy Corbyn here with us today. I think Jeremy is clearly a man who needs no introduction, but Jeremy, you know, he's a friend of the working class, he's a friend of all struggles against the system. You know, when he's not rallying against the system, you'll find him on picket lines and all sorts. So look, I'm really proud to have Jeremy speaking on 3 books that changed the world. I'm sure it's quite hard, there's a lot of important books out there, but Jeremy's going to be speaking for about 20 minutes or so, and what we're going to do, in order to try and fit as many questions in as possible, we're not going to do the breakout rooms, we're going to go straight in to discussion. Obviously the crowd is very big. If you want to speak, you're going to have to try and make yourselves as visible as possible, and I'll try and squeeze as many people in, after which Jeremy Corbyn will come back in. So look, without further ado, I'll hand over to Jeremy Corbyn.
I hope you don't mind I sit down, so that way we can get it live streamed elsewhere. Is that okay? And for those beyond the tent, I hope it doesn't rain. And thank you for your kind remarks about the system. I often think the system is quite severely stacked against all of us, actually, but that's probably why we're here today. Could I just start by just saying a huge thank you to Bookmarks for putting this event on, for hosting the bookshop, for the publications that you do, and the way in which you give space to people to explore their ideas, new writers to get their books on sale and published, and the way in which you help so many people to start to gain a grasp of how important books are in their lives. And we had a wonderful anniversary for Bookmarks a while back at that wonderful church in Oxford Street, and I thought the best line was that the day that the new store opened in Bloomsbury, because before that it was in Finsbury Park, sorry it left, apparently the staff were sitting there staring at the door wondering what the first customer would want, and after about 20 minutes the door opens, 2 customers walk in, and they rush forward and say, anything we'd like to get you, anything, what are your books you're looking for? They said, have you got anything about the royal family? I should imagine the nearest they got to would be Queen Mab by Shelley or something like that. I would imagine that would be the nearest. And since we're in SOAS, if I could just say something personal to me, but I'm sure to many others. Next weekend we're going to be remembering the life of Annabel Sreberny, who was a teacher at SOAS. She was a wonderful sister, a wonderful comrade. I knew her mum and the rest of her family, great campaigner for social justice and so on, and I found her an incredible supporter, particularly when the media were at their most abusive. She was at her strongest. So thank you, Annabel, for what you did in your life. And when we're talking of books, when Lewis contacted me and said, you know, we want you to choose 3 books that changed the world, oh my God, you know, choose the first 300 and then sort of mark it down from there and keep marking it down until you get to 3. And I said, well, actually, that's impossible. And he said, no, it's 3. Thanks, Lewis. Anyway, well, I was thinking more and more about this, and I think the important thing is actually to discuss and think about the way in which history is presented, the way in which history is analysed, and how that analysis changes our current perceptions and gives us an understanding of the politics of the wars, the poverty, the injustice and the inequality, and the successes of social movements of today, and how they're so often rooted in history. And I'm always inspired by the way, particularly in Latin American movements, they're never shy or afraid to talk about historical figures from even the pre-Spanish colonial or Portuguese colonial period, because they see them as inspirations, such as Tupac Amaru and others like that. And so in looking for books, I've come across three that I think fit the bill and are interesting. There isn't going to be time to go through all three of them. So the one I want to particularly emphasize is this one. An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. I'll come to it in a moment, but it's a truly remarkable book because it taught me a great deal in reading it, but it also helps to, if you like, square the circle on the reanalysis of American history in a way that we've only done in bits and pieces over the past 50 years or so in the re-examination of the history of the United States and America in general. The second book is one that I really enjoyed reading, and I thank her for writing it. It's by Primavada Gopal, Insurgent Empire, Anti-colonial Resistance and British Dissent from Colonial Activities all around the world. Because again, all of us here, I should imagine, would be in solidarity with oppressed peoples all around the world. It wasn't always obvious to oppressed peoples all around the world that the working class movement at the centre of the British Empire was in solidarity with them. It's not to say there weren't many people who were, but in general they were often seen to be missing and wanting in that. And the last book, which I will refer to but not quote extensively from, is the amazing book by the late Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States, which is a short book, so I'll just quote a little bit of it as we go through our discussion. Now, I chose these books because to me they are an enormous inspiration. But there are other books that have often inspired people, which we could have chosen today. We could have chosen The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist because of its simplicity in the way it's written and the way in which a group of workers in Mugsborough, otherwise known as Hastings, some people in Hastings still call it Mugsborough and the other way around, it described to them how their philanthropy was the work they did for low wages in order to make somebody else very rich. And it's because it's such a simple message, it's actually a very, very powerful one for all that. Sometimes the simplest messages are the most powerful. And then the other one that I was thinking about choosing but decided to go for these instead was, of course, 10 Days That Shook the World by John Reed, a description of the Russian Revolution of 1917, but also the book that John Reed wrote about the Mexican Revolution in 1910, I think it was. And there are so many others, but I would also urge you to, if you haven't already read it, in the context of the history of Americas and Latin America, do read Open Veins in Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. It's absolutely incredible because it gives you the strength of understanding of the cultural diversity of Latin America. And if you want to learn about the slave trade, sometimes the intellectual works and the facts and all that, very, very powerful, of course. But sometimes when it's told through the narrative of a story, it becomes more powerful. And my great friend Remy Capo, who's writing a trilogy on the slave trade, has published 2 of them. And I do urge you to look him up, Remy Capo, K-A-P-O, and read Forgotten Harvest. And it is the description of how some slaves managed to escape from slavery in the Caribbean, but he traces the whole thing back to the families in what was then called the Guinea coast, and how they then managed to smuggle themselves onto a slave ship going back to pick up goods in Britain while they were carrying sugar and rum and stuff to the UK, or Britain as it then was called, and then managed to get off the ship and be hidden in London by working class communities in London that prevented slave hunters from capturing them and trying to send them back into slavery. It's a very, very powerful novel, very heavily researched, and again, that's something that teaches us all a great deal. So I do urge you to look at some of those books if you would. And so in the case of Roxanne's book, what it does is tells us about the history of Indigenous peoples in the United States from a perspective that is not normally seen, because I just remember once going to a museum in Texas. It was a museum of rural life, and it wasn't the most inspiring museum that I've been to in my life. I had a look around it, and there was sort of a few old mowing machines, a couple of ploughs, and a reconstruction of a shack, and then a bit about people being given land in Texas. And so I looked around it, and then as the curator came over to me, and she said, "How did you find our museum, sir?" And I said, "Well, it was very interesting, but there's a big question in my mind." And she said, "So what's the big question in your mind?" I said, "Well, it's just this. It was puzzling me all the way I was walking around." She said, "What was puzzling you, sir?" I said, "Just a question." She said, "Yeah, what's your question?" I said, "What was here before?" Okay. And she said, "Before what?" I said, "Before the European settlement in this part of Texas." And she looked at me and she said, "We're not allowed to talk about that. We've been told not to take that as up." I said, "What?" She said, "Well, there was nothing here. There was nothing there." And then, I know that's not totally the norm with American teaching, it isn't, but to me it was something quite eye-opening that the only history they were prepared to consider was that of colonial settlements, which obviously destroyed what was the Indigenous people's society, culture, agriculture, and everything else. And what Roxanne's book does is painstakingly analyses all of that in a quite incredible way, and researches it right down to which nation was destroyed and what happened in the destruction of those nations. And so there's an awful lot I could quote from the book, but I won't do it all because that would take us all a bit too long. But the point she uses, and I quote here, "The charge of genocide, once unacceptable by establishment academic and political classes when applied to the United States, has gained currency as evidence of it has mounted. Is too often accompanied by an assumption of disappearance, so I realised it was crucial to make the reality and significance of Indigenous people's survival clear throughout the book. Indigenous survival as peoples is due to centuries of resistance and storytelling passed through generations." Then she goes on to explain how she's tried to demonstrate all of that. And so it is one of the genocide of people that already lived there. And then she goes on, which I found powerful and very disturbing, to describe the role of various later to become very famous American figures, including Sherman, and what he was up to. Now, the UN Convention on Prevention of Genocide in 1948 describes killing members of a group, causing bodily harm, mental harm, etc., and a whole lot of other things through it. But it also goes on in this book to describe the systematic murder of large numbers of Indigenous people as the settlers moved westwards in the USA. And as they moved westwards, they were all offered land by the nascent United States, and in offering that land to the United States, to the settlers, their job was to drive the Indigenous peoples off that land. And Sherman, Andrew Jackson, and a number of others were actually in the military, and indeed almost every American president at some time had been in the military fighting the so-called Indian Wars to drive people off that particular land. And by the 1950s, the amount of land, by 1955, that the Native Americans, Indigenous Americans actually had was 2.3% of the amount that had been allocated to them in 1881. So in a period of 70 years, the United States, having allegedly come to an agreement with the indigenous peoples that this would be their land, 97.7% of it was taken away and destroyed. And all of that land was offered over to settlers. Now, the interesting thing is, when you discuss and listen to the stories of the settlers, they themselves were people who, they themselves were people who had often, Europeans, who had come from poverty and oppression in Western Europe. They'd come from religious pressures and religious intolerance. There were homeless people, there were landless people from this country, from Ireland, from Scotland, and many other places. Now, some of them were great people who went on to defend the rights of indigenous people and to oppose slavery in the United States. But many were converted into the idea that somehow or other they were moving into a land where nothing existed, there was no history, it was just vacant land ready for them to farm and take over, and it was then allocated to them on the basis of their right to access to land. And it was, of course, that buy-in which gave the United States the support it needed in the Civil War against the southern states, and whilst that war was at one level fought over the issue of slavery, at another level it was actually completely ignorant, and deliberately so, of the needs of the indigenous people, and their land was taken away and further destroyed. And what, again, this refusal to examine so much the history, if you go back, and we'll go back a long way here, 8,500 years, there were 7 areas of the world at that time that were developing a form of agriculture of some sort. 3 of those were in the Americas. They were the Central American Valley, the Andes, and the east coast of what is now the USA. In other words, 2 of them were in either what is now Mexico or North America. And they were all based on the growth of maize or corn, which is why it's such a revered product even today everywhere, because it was the one sustainable product that was grown there. And it was this deliberate ignorance of history which enabled the supremacy of the settlers to take over and the very rich landowners, most of whom dominated the US governments at that time. Now, I'm going to quote something here, and I'll see if any of you recognise it. Let me just find it one second. I'll quote this and see if you recognise it. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the exploration, enslavement and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalled the rosy dawn era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief monuments of prior accumulation. Marx, very good. Who was first with Marx? Gentleman in the hat in the second row, well done. And so that's where, in a sense, the Marxist analysis comes into the book. And then I think in reading this you should look at the parallel struggles that were going on here at the same time. Some of those people that ended up in Canada or USA in the 19th century were in fact people driven off their land by the enclosure of commons in Britain particularly, and in Scotland were driven off the Highlands, and ended up in the USA thinking that it was a place they could go to get land. And indeed you may read quite a lot of the actually quite radical writings of the 18th and 19th century after US independence. They're almost completely ignorant of 2 factors. One was the rights and role of indigenous people within the United States, but also completely ignorant, or deliberately so, of the slave trade, the ownership of slaves and the existence of the slave trade. And whilst, again, there was solidarity movements and so on, let's never say there weren't, but that was the norm of it. And so what this book does is helps us to understand the solidarity that grew up between the indigenous peoples of the United States and the slaves. In some cases, they were almost swapped over. And so when the American forces managed to occupy the East Coast and New York, after independence in most cases, they occupied that and took over. What happened then was the indigenous people that had fought back very bravely and been killed in enormous numbers in these battles, because they basically didn't have anything like the equivalent power or weaponry of the European forces, even though they were in much greater numbers, they were then sent to the Caribbean as slaves, and in return slaves were brought from the Caribbean to take over the land that had been deliberately driven up, where the indigenous people had been deliberately driven off it. And so it was that was going on. But this was accompanied by the use of language. The use of language. Now, how many times do you hear as a term of abuse saying, oh, it's like Indian country, Indian territory? That was the whole process of the Indian Wars in the United States. The wars that moved west of the Mississippi, in order to establish the United States as, to quote, running from sea to shining sea, right across the whole continental divide, but at that time excluding California and what is now Arizona. And accompanied to that point was the Louisiana Purchase. When the USA decided it was going to expand east of the Mississippi, they bought from France, basically, the western half of the United States, with the exception of what was then Spanish-occupied California and Arizona. They paid no heed whatsoever to the nations that were there. Those nations were all systematically destroyed by the settlements that moved in. And in the wars against Mexico, where the US simply invaded Mexico in order to promote trade and set up the Santa Fe Trail to take them all the way down there, they then forced a group of the Mexican army to surrender in San Francisco. And indeed there's a monument in the middle of San Francisco which commemorates the point when California became part of the USA. Now, if there's any Mexicans here, I'm sure and I know there's one, there's Laura here for a start, who absolutely do not accept or agree with that. That was just conquest of Mexico at that time. And so you then ask yourself the question, this is where the book concludes, where does all this take us to? It takes us to an idea that the US grew out of the supremacy of the American government over the indigenous peoples of the USA. It developed a massive army, it developed a massive military tradition, and it spawned with it decades and decades, nay, more than a century, of novels, films and programs and so on about the Indian Wars, how the West was won, the battle to win the West, the fight against indigenous peoples and so on. And it did two things. It created a popular myth that there was somehow or other some moral right in conquering the west of the United States, and they had a moral obligation to do so. And that moral obligation was then morphed into a moral obligation to start influencing other places around the world, particularly the Monroe Doctrine in respect of arrangements with South America, but also the later expansion of the USA. And then when you look at the names on some of the weapons and the tanks that were used in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and so on, you again find the names of those generals that took part in the genocide against the indigenous peoples of the USA, and they developed that military power that was able to do that. So they lived on the myth of the everlasting wilderness that needed to be settled and needed to be occupied. They lived on deliberately suppressing the history of the indigenous peoples of the USA, and it grew rich through the slave trade and slavery. The long-term effects of the slave trade and the racism that had to be indoctrinated into the rest of the white population in order for it to succeed is still there within the racism. It's opposed still there by Black Lives Matters. It's opposed by indigenous people opposing the Dakota Pipeline and so much else. And so it is that understanding of history that gives us the understanding and the chance to win things back. Walt Whitman wrote poems that were frankly just blatantly racist, which preceded the Louisiana Purchase and the wars against Mexico and the development of California as a state on its own. And so this book to me was very inspiring, and very briefly, before I don't want to go on for too long, I just want to draw attention to the second book I've chosen, which is Insurgent Empire by Primavada Gopal. Now I'm sure many of you have seen it and read this book. It's deliberately linking the anti-colonial resistance and British dissent. And it opens with a very powerful message from Frederick Douglass, a leader of the anti-slavery movement in New York in 1957, and then goes on to discuss the ways in which Douglass and his compatriots did so much to raise awareness of the slave trade and eventually a defeat of it, and puts that alongside the history of the British colonial occupation of India, the way in which the reporting and history of India was dealt with by the British media at the time. Now, I'm sure every one of you at the school would have heard something about Indian history, if only in the context of the Raj and sort of various, many of these tedious films about the Raj and Downton Abbey and all the rest of it. You'd have also probably been told at school that one of the problems in India was the Indian Mutiny of 1857. Now just unpick that one for a moment. A mutiny is something that traditionally happens on a ship when the crew are fed up with the captain and they decide to replace the captain with a democratic choice of somebody else. And the mutiny was presented as just that. It was a small mutiny of Indian soldiers conscripted into the British Army. It wasn't. It was a massive uprising against British colonial rule in India, which is deliberately downplayed in our analysis of the history of that time. So the use of language and analysis in history tends again to form opinions which then can morph into racist supremacy ideas, can morph into all sorts of things at a later stage. And so that's why her book, which also shows the levels of solidarity, and I want to conclude by giving two examples of the amazing levels of solidarity that did happen. After the Second World War, India gained its independence mainly because Britain couldn't do anything else. It was rushed, and hence the partition that happened, and we're all paying the price of partition ever since then, which cost the lives of over 1 million people in the subsequent war that followed from Indian independence. But other European colonies were not liberated in any way. Remember, this was the Second World War that was fought to defeat the domination of the Nazis, to drive the Nazis out of the Soviet Union, out of France and Netherlands and so on, and to defeat Nazism in Europe. We would all go along with that, I'm sure. But the other side of it was not the liberation of the colonies of European nations, to the extent that in 1945 the Viet Minh rose up against the French domination of Vietnam, the French colonial occupation of Vietnam, There weren't any French troops to go there because they were still being reassembled in France after the liberation of France from the Nazis. So the British went in and did the job for them for a while and occupied Vietnam until the French could get there to take over, and resolutely refused Ho Chi Minh's demand for self-determination and independence for the whole of Vietnam at that time. The French turned up, the British retreated and went away, and the French then fought a war which went on for another 9 years, which ended with their defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Had Britain not involved itself in Vietnam, which had no business being in anyway, in 1945, maybe independence would have come straight away. Maybe there would never have been a Vietnam War. Maybe all those millions that died need not have died as a result of it. But Britain wasn't done there. The Dutch hadn't managed to get back to Indonesia in order to control Indonesia. So the British went into Indonesia to take control of the situation. They didn't have enough troops, didn't have enough equipment, so they de-imprisoned Japanese prisoners of war and put them to fight the independence movement of the Indonesian people against the Dutch control of Indonesia. And then the Dutch arrived and took it over and went on with it. So there's some aspects of history that are often forgotten. The last thing is on Kenya. Kenya, I was brought up with on the idea that the Mau Mau Rising was somewhere or other very bad thing, and the Mau Mau did terrible things and opposed the British and so on. Two things: yes, there were atrocities, there were excesses and all sorts of things, but the numbers of them were greatly exaggerated. But what was it really about? It was about land, and Kenya had been allocated as the colony for settlement of European people in a way that Uganda never was, even though it's a neighbour to it. And a number of people in Britain did show enormous solidarity with the victims, the Kikuyu people, and the victims of the Mau Mau fighters who had been trying to gain independence, one of which was Fenner Brockway, Tony Benn, and others in the 1950s, raised all these issues, and from that formed the movement for colonial freedom, which later became liberation, and they were an important factor in bringing about independence from Kenya. There's so much to read about our history, but basically the history of liberation comes to the liberation of people themselves, the way in which it was slaves who ended slavery, it was the people that fought back against apartheid that ended apartheid in South Africa, and it was many very brave people that fought back against Indian occupation that eventually brought about independence for India. So I think we need to be analysing and studying history with the broadest mind possible, and I think that the two of the three books I've mentioned here do help us to look at it through the window in a different way than probably we've ever looked at it before. And when we look at it in that way, it empowers us to have that understanding. Wars of colonialism, of imperialism, of theft of resources are obviously wrong. We all pay the price. In civil liberties, in cost, in destruction, and we live with the bitterness that goes on for years and years. So when we said in 2003 that this war in Iraq will lead to the refugee flows, the bitterness, the poverty, and the terrorism of tomorrow, where were we wrong, sadly? So, analyse history, understand history, see the racism that we're taught through history, oppose it and look at it from a different perspective. That will make us all stronger and better equipped for the struggles of today and tomorrow and in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. We're now going to go straight into discussion to try and squeeze as many people in as possible. Excuse me.
What's going on, Jeremy? Well, since they gave me the mic, I'll just say this. As a leader of the labor movement from the U.S. and being put on international scale now, trying to build this international solidarity in the labor movement. As a leader in general, you know, it's a lot to deal with, right? It's a lot as one person to try to solve the problems of the world, right? And when we talk to Jeremy, and it's obviously that he inspires millions of people across the country, and the same thing for myself. When I got fired from Amazon 3 years ago, I didn't know 3 years from now I'd be standing here talking to you as the first union president of Amazon workers in America. So, thank you. And I say, you know, as a leader, we got to take the good with the bad. And a lot of people ask us questions on how we can solve a lot of things. And, you know, we may not have all the answers at the time. But by organizing, I realized that opened up different doors and different lanes. So as people, just understand that the fight that Jeremy is taking up, political fight, it's not just him alone. It's you guys as well. Everybody, when we're talking about a revolution, the revolution starts with yourselves. So remember that it's everybody's fight. It is not just one man's failure. We all got to continue to organize, because organizing is going to open up different lanes for us. If we don't do that, nothing is going to be given to us. Thank you.
Well, I too am very interested in Jeremy's fiction recommendations and any recommendations for reads for this summer holiday. But look, I want to thank Jeremy for being here today. Because look, when so many people on the right have turned their back on Jeremy or tried to silence him, I'm really proud that Bookmarks Bookshop and Marxism Festival are hosting this event today, and I think the size of the crowd shows the support that Jeremy has. I cannot see Sir Keir Starmer getting similar numbers to the ones we've got here today. But listening to what Jeremy talked about the different books, I think it reminds us why the right try and silence our side. And I mean that in two ways. Firstly, it's because we say we won't forget the crimes of colonialism, of imperialism, and the way that capitalism has exploited people across the world. And the books that Jeremy talk about go through that in such rigorous detail that we need to keep arming ourselves with that. But the second reason, I think, and particularly Howard Zinn's book on a people's history of the US, it reminds us of the hidden history of struggle of ordinary people. Every single time, every instance of colonialism, of imperialism, people have fought back. It's true of India, it's true of America, it's true of everywhere across the world. And those two lessons, I think, will serve us well in all the different struggles, as well as addressing some of the political questions that were raised. So thank you, Jeremy, and I know that everyone here wants to say that we're fully behind you with what might happen in the future in Islington.
I just want to say apologies to people who didn't get called. Jeremy spoke with us last year, he's spoken at Marxism before. Hopefully you might be able to see him next year. Let's see if we haven't won the revolution by that. I just want to invite Judy to make a very special announcement before I bring Jeremy to sum up. So just whilst Jeremy sort of gathers his thoughts, I guess.
Thank you, Jeremy. You're going to be very busy in responding to all those questions. Jeremy gave us a great quote from Karl Marx, and I want to start with Marx as well, because we are, after all, at an event called Marxism 23. In 1868, Marx was 50 years old. It was his birthday, and his mum wrote to him and said, "If only you had made some capital instead of spending your life writing about capital." And we are in the tradition of Marx, I'm afraid, in that we're not writing to our mums, but we are depending on you, our friends, our supporters, those who feel solidarity with our event, to dig deep. So yes, I'm afraid this is a money appeal. What we have achieved this weekend so far is to plant a small red flag in the heart of the beast, in a city which symbolises the British establishment. And we've planted a little red flag here on the lawns of these universities, which should be cathedrals to the sort of learning that Jeremy's explained to us so brilliantly, but instead are treating that knowledge as a commodity, as something to be monetised and something to make profit from. But this weekend, we have clarified all these different ideas, from economic crisis and Lenin to the Sopranos and artificial intelligence, all these different ideas buzzing around. And as importantly, we've created networks of people who are going to go back from London to Coventry, to Aberdeen, to Portsmouth, and organise to begin to fight to change this system. And we've had a free creche, which makes me really proud, because I think we should have free creches and people shouldn't be penalised for having children. When Marx wrote about money, he said that money was a morbid symptom of our alienation. Money stands between us and the fulfilment of our human capacities and the satisfaction of our human needs. So we're going to do you a really big favour. We're going to relieve you some of that alienated money. We're going to ask you to put it in the buckets that are being passed around, and thank you very much for your support.
Thank you. And if you're putting stuff in the buckets, it's very quiet. If you just put paper in there, it's much easier that way. First of all, thanks for all the questions, and thank you all for being here. I found it really interesting and really stimulating, and very happy to have those kind of debates and discussions. And I'm very grateful for all of the questions that have been asked. Yes, there are many people that have many analysis of my time as leader of the Labour Party, and indeed I've read quite a lot of books about it. Some of them have even been sent to me to read myself, which is very kind of the authors. My own analysis is heading towards a publisher and will be published next year, and I hope you'll enjoy reading that, and I'd be happy to come here and talk about it. But I fully understand the frustrations that many people have expressed about a lot of things. I fully understand them. Don't believe I don't feel those frustrations myself. Didn't then, and haven't ever since, and don't still now. I do. I understand them. But the whole point that I put forward in 2015, when my name was first put forward to be leader of the Labour Party, was to expand and democratise and make accountable our movement. And so membership did grow to 600,000. There was a massive increase in activity, there was an increase in solidarity activity, and all the other things that went with it. Did I make mistakes? Of course I did. I made loads of mistakes. Show me the human being that's tried to do something and hasn't made a mistake. It's there with all of us. But it is about democracy of our movement, but it's also understanding the power that the media have over all of us. Now, all of you here, nice, good socialists, all of us, and we read essentially the news from each other, and we're boosted by that. There's a news agenda out there that's doing the very opposite. Run by Murdoch, run by the Mail, run by the Telegraph, run by Fox News and all the others, that's setting an agenda of individualism, of greed, of environmental destruction, of denigration of anyone that stands up on behalf of others. Denigration of Chris because he stood up for Amazon workers. Denigration of anyone else. I remember when Cesar Chavez was condemned for standing up for union rights in the USA, and so on and so on. And last week I was speaking at a funeral with Arthur Scargill, and I just was thinking all that Scargill went through during the 84-85 miners' strike. And so our ability to communicate with each other and build up alternative sources and methods of communication is absolutely central and essential to the left in this country. And you build up that support by taking part where actions take place. I've been inspired on the picket lines I've been on the last few months. The postal workers, the teachers, the rail workers, the civil servants, nurses, so many other people. But what's different about the strikes this time, very different, I mean, so there are some people in this tent or outside this tent who have got the same life experience of me of all these industrial disputes. There was a time years ago when if you turned up on a picket line and said, by the way, I've got somebody here who's from the homeless campaign, they'd like to speak, and people would turn around and say, well, what's that got to do with us? We're on strike for our wages, that's their business. Seriously. And you had to argue for getting other causes involved in the dispute. Not this time. Not this time at all. When refugee rights campaigns are welcomed on Dockers picket lines, it shows we've made a lot of progress. And you should think about that. And so, what happens in the future is, yes, we're here campaigning. Yes, we're united in our endeavours to try to get decent wages, to prevent privatisation of the National Health Service, to bring the water industry into democratic public ownership. £72 billion paid out in dividends since water privatisation, and 1,000 sewage leaks per day into rivers in England alone. That says everything you need to know about what privatisation and private enterprise is about where public services are concerned. So it's all these campaigns that unite us. Do I have a simple wave of the wand to say we're all going to join the SWP, all going to join the Green Party, all going to join a party that doesn't exist or whatever? No, I don't, honestly, I don't. But I do know that there has to be space for a united organisation, space for support for the 5 principles that we've set out through the Peace and Justice Project. 5 principles about wage increases, about environmental protection, about ending the housing crisis, and about peace and justice around the world. They are things that anyone in this room could sign up to and unite us. That network unites us, and you never know where networks might lead to in collective action in the future. But we need to be respectful and supportive of each other. Last couple of points I want to make. On the BDS bill, thanks very much for the question. Very, very important to oppose this bill, because this bill goes alongside the police bill, it goes alongside the immigration bill, and it goes alongside a whole agenda being put forward by the Tory government, which denies and prevents the right to demonstrate, to take effective industrial action, or to express yourself. And when a government minister introduces a bill that she herself announces is illegal within the 1998 Human Rights Act, you've got to ask yourself a question. I'm a member of the Council of Europe, which is a parliamentary body of MPs from all European countries. It's not a European Union initiative, it's much older than that. And when I describe this bill, people are sort of staring at me saying, what? What? I mean, these are not necessarily the most left-wing people in the world, but even they are saying, well, how can a government that signs up to the European Convention on Human Rights specifically introduce a bill that it contravenes the European Convention on Human Rights? And we're using that argument to try to stop people, desperate people, who are trying to survive in this world and make their contribution to this world, from being sent to Rwanda and instead being made welcome and supported in this country as refugees should be welcomed and supported as victims of war, of human rights abuse and so much else in this world. On the Amazon workers, I'm so full of admiration for Chris and the Amazon workers and what they've done. I've been there supporting them, we'll always support them, and let's organise gig economy workers all over the world. They're the new quasi-employed dock workers and building workers of yesteryear, are the gig workers, Deliveroo and Uber Eats, etc. of today. You might not be queuing up outside a pub on a Monday morning hoping to get a day's work on a building site. Instead, you're staring at a mobile phone hoping you'll be given half an hour to deliver a burger to somebody who can't be bothered to cook it themselves. And so that is the nature of employment. And I've met workers on delivery runs and so on who don't know who their employer is, have never spoken to anybody at their so-called employer. All they do is get messages on a mobile phone of what they've got to do, and if they do it in the time required and the temperature's right on the food they've delivered, they get paid for doing it. If it's not, they don't get paid. It's brutal. It's horrible. They've no idea what their income's going to be. They've no idea if they can pay their rent. They've no idea if they can buy their food. That is the brutality of modern Britain, modern Europe and modern USA. Come on guys, we can do better than that by organising all those into unions in order to protect wages and conditions. And it is also about inspiration. And I was really grateful for the question about poetry, and had I gone on for another hour I'd have been quoting a lot of poetry at you. But personally I love poetry. Personally, I love poetry because poets tell truths in a way that others don't, because they're under no constraint of what they write. And young people's poetry is sometimes frightening, sometimes depressing, often very, very inspiring. And where we got the idea of this book, Poetry for the Many, from was Len McCluskey and I were having a long discussion about economic strategy, and he sort of he looked over my shoulder and said, "Why have you got so many poetry books on you, in the bookcase behind your desk?" And I said, "Well, why shouldn't I?" Come on, Dan, what are you talking about? Well, why shouldn't I have poetry books? He said, "No, it's just you've got one there I haven't got." And so we then got into a discussion about poetry being a release for people and a form of expression for people. And so we then decided we'd organise an evening of poetry at the Casa in Liverpool. And I was a bit nervous about this, so we go into the Casa to have this event with Melissa Ben sort of hosting it. And as we're walking along the road towards the Casa, I said, "Len, I hope we got this thing right. This might be a disaster." He said, "It's a bit bloody late to think about that now, isn't it? It's on in half an hour." So I went there, massive queue of people outside, and we read poetry, discussed why we were inspired by it, and then I noticed a group of young people in the middle going like this, and I said, "What's the matter?" They said, "Can we read our poems?" I said, "Go right ahead, please do." And so a lot of young people turned up and read their poetry as well. So we've published this book. It'll be out on sale in August and onwards, and full promotion and so on in November. And there's Maxine Peake, Michael Rosen, a number of others, Lexi Sale and so on, have all chosen poems, and Len and myself, and we've analysed them all. And we do it because I think that we have to unlock and unleash the imagination, particularly in young people, which is why I was so keen in the last election manifesto of a pupil premium, arts premium, so that every school would get a budget for every child to learn a musical instrument, act on the stage, learn about poetry, learn about theatre. Don't leave it to the public schools. Let's unleash the imagination that's there in the working class community. And so my last message is, yes, fight back for decent wages, and for young people. Education as a right, not a privilege. Healthcare as a right, not a privilege. Housing rent controls as a right, not a privilege. And let's remount those campaigns to end the student debt and end the tuition fees at universities. We're a rich country, we can well afford to ensure there's total free education for all. That's what real liberation will be about. Thank you very much.